They were never meant to hear this. Not you, not me, not anyone outside the locked archives of Virginia's colonial courts. Yet the truth leaks like blood through the cracks of history, and once you've heard it, you can't go back. December 1756. A mansion on the James River, flickering candlelight over polished mahogany, a family gathered for a grand dinner. They laugh, raise their cups, bite into roasted pork, sweet puddings, cornbread. Within hours, every single one of them is dead. Convulsions twisting their bodies, eyes bulging, tongues blackened. A sickly scent of almonds and rot leaking from their mouths. And standing behind them, silent, her face unreadable, is the woman who prepared every dish. Sarah Williams. Enslaved, invisible, until she made herself unforgettable. Pause, let the weight of that settle. And if you feel something shifting inside you, comment, "The table is a weapon," twice below. Because this is not entertainment, it's initiation. The official records were sealed, fragments scattered across counties, testimonies hidden, evidence destroyed in an accidental fire. They buried this case because it revealed something more dangerous than death knowledge. That an enslaved woman could take everything the masters fed her. Chains, humiliation, silence, and feed it back to them as poison. Sarah was no ordinary cook. She was a keeper of memory, torn from Angola, dragged across oceans, sold and resold. Yet she carried with her the forbidden science of plants. Roots that heal, seeds that sicken, leaves that kill. Knowledge the slave system could never chain, because it passed mouth to mouth, hand to hand, hidden beneath the lashes of the overseer's whip. For 15 years she served them, listening, learning, watching. They thought her loyalty was obedience. They never realized her silence was calculation. Every herb she touched, every spice she mixed, every fire she fed. She was building the language of her vengeance. Before we continue, I want 2 things from you. Subscribe now, because this story is only the first doorway into the chambers of history they never wanted opened, and comment where you're watching from. Let me see the map of awakened minds. This tale isn't about the past. It's about the system you live in now, the same system that fears your knowledge, the same system that prays you'll keep swallowing lies instead of tasting the truth. Picture the plantation house, its windows glowing against the winter dark, brick walls standing like a fortress of wealth. But inside, it was a coffin waiting to be sealed. The Calverton family represented everything the Virginia elite wanted to preserve: tobaccoed wealth, aristocratic bloodlines, alliances built on land, slaves, and trade. Yet one enslaved woman would unravel all of it, with nothing but patience, fire, and knowledge. History paints men like Edmund Calverton as masters of their world, commanders of acres, fortunes, and human lives. But true mastery doesn't come from land or labor. It comes from perception. Sarah Williams saw what they could not. She saw that their empire was fragile, that their very survival depended on the invisible hands that lit their fires, dressed their children, and fed their mouths. They thought her powerless, but every day she stood in the kitchen, her hands shaping the meals that sustained their illusion of control. Do you understand the terror of that? The knife wasn't in her hand, it was in the stew. The weapon wasn't steel, it was knowledge. That's why this story was buried, because if slaves learned they could turn the master's luxuries into the master's poison, the entire economy of bondage would collapse overnight. Sarah waited 15 years. Not because she was docile, but because timing was everything. You don't strike when you're angry. You strike when the house is cold, when debts are rising, when the family is distracted by infighting and desperation. That winter, the Calvertons were cracking. A bad harvest had cut their profits. Their son returned from London with dangerous ideas that clashed with his father. Their daughter's marriage negotiations stalled. Even the youngest boy whispered sympathies for the enslaved. The great dynasty was splintering from within. Sarah only needed to push. Think about that. One woman enslaved, voiceless in the eyes of law, erased in the ledgers, yet she waited, studied, prepared, and chose her moment with precision sharper than any blade. She didn't just kill, she orchestrated. This is what they never wanted you to know. Rebellion isn't always a scream in the night or a blade drawn in daylight. Sometimes it's silence, sometimes it's a meal, and sometimes it's a woman who remembers the taste of freedom in a world built to erase her memory. They told themselves that Sarah Williams was a cook, a servant, a pair of hands. But that was the lie plantation masters had to believe, that knowledge could be stripped away with chains. What they never understood was that knowledge travels in the body. It hides in the blood, in the tongue, in memory itself. Sarah was born across the Atlantic in Angola, in a world the Calvertons could never imagine. There, plants were not just food. They were language, medicine, and weaponry. Elders whispered which root could heal fever, which bark soothed childbirth, which berry carried sleep into the bones, and which leaf carried death into the blood. These weren't stories. They were survival codes. When Sarah was captured in tribal war, chained, marched to the coast, and sold to Portuguese traders, they stripped her of her name, but not her memory. Even aboard the dark belly of the slave ship, surrounded by screams, vomit, and chains, she would have recognized the bitter taste of certain leaves thrown in the gruel, used to quiet those too loud for the voyage. Knowledge never dies, it adapts. In Barbados, she cooked for sugar planters, learning European recipes, watching which imports they prized. Almonds, cinnamon, nutmeg. She memorized how these flavors could disguise bitterness, how the smell of roasted meats could mask a toxin's undertone. When sold again to Virginia, she stepped into the Calverton kitchen already fluent in 2 languages, theirs and hers. They saw a cook. What they had actually purchased was a chemist disguised as property. Now imagine her in that cold kitchen, embers glowing, knives lined in silence, shelves heavy with spices locked away by the mistress. Every spice, every herb, every grain of imported sugar became dual in her hands. To the family it was luxury. To Sarah, it was power, waiting to be activated. The almond scent of cyanide, the sweetness that coats a tongue even as it destroys the lungs. This is why they buried her story, because it revealed a truth more dangerous than rebellion. That within every plantation, the enslaved held invisible arsenals, memories of botany, medicine, and chemistry the masters could neither understand nor control. Sarah was proof that knowledge is contraband, and when contraband becomes action, dynasties fall. The table was set like an altar, silver polished until it gleamed like mirrors, wine reflecting the candle flames, roasted meats releasing a perfume of comfort and tradition. The Calverton family gathered, their voices echoing in the great dining hall, layered with laughter that felt hollow, strained. They believed this was celebration. They did not know it was ceremony. The first toast was raised, crystal glasses lifted, wine passed across lips already marked for death. Sarah stood nearby, the invisible orchestrator. Her eyes scanned the room, not in fear, not in haste, but in precision. She had prepared each dish with a surgeon's discipline, layering flavor upon flavor until bitterness hid beneath sweetness, until poison became invisible inside pleasure. 3 seconds pass. Comment, the table is a weapon, twice now if you feel it, because this isn't just their story, it's yours. Margaret Calverton, the matriarch, tasted first. She praised the pork, its tenderness, the richness of the herbs. Colonel Hartwell followed, chewing slowly, nodding at the stuffing, oblivious that every bite was a countdown. Thomas, freshly returned from London, spoke of progress, of new methods for plantations, while death was already dissolving into his blood. Young Edmund Jr. smirked at his sister Catherine's refined manners, their laughter covering the fact that each swallow was sealing their fate. Sarah moved silently between them, refilling glasses, adjusting plates. Every gesture was normal, every movement rehearsed. That was her genius. Poison doesn't shout, poison waits. It slides through the throat under the cover of spice, wine, and comfort. Minutes turned into an hour. Conversation swelled. Plans for marriage, debts, harvests, alliances. And then the first cough. Subtle. A hand to the throat, a forced laugh. Another cough from the opposite end of the table. Then a glass slipping, spilling red wine across the linen like blood. The room shifted. Jokes died on lips. Eyes darted, searching for explanation, but it was already too late. Their stomachs churned, their bodies convulsed. Catherine clutched her abdomen, teeth grinding against screams. Thomas's face purpled, veins swelling as though trying to burst from his skull. Margaret collapsed forward, her fork clattering to the floor. Sarah watched, calm, steady, not triumphant, not hysterical, only silent, as if she had known this moment her whole life. The family who once called her property was now writhing at her feet, powerless, broken, choking on the very meal they demanded she serve. the dining room descended into chaos. The air thickened with the stench of vomit, sweat, and that strange sweetness of almonds that clung to the breath of the dying. Plates crashed to the floor. Wine spilled like blood across the tablecloth. Chairs scraped violently against the wooden floor as bodies twisted and fell. Thomas Calverton, once so confident in his London education, was on his knees, clawing at his own throat. His eyes bulged, veins pulsing blue, black against his pale skin. Catherine screamed, a sound strangled by the tightening of her windpipe, her delicate hands clawing at the corset that bound her ribs, as though freeing her lungs could force life back in. The matriarch, Margaret, convulsed so violently her powdered wig slid sideways, exposing her sweat-soaked scalp. Even in her last moments, she tried to call for order, but her voice collapsed into a rasping gurgle. Colonel Hartwell, their guest and business partner, staggered from his chair, knocking the silver candelabrum to the ground, flame licking at the tablecloth. He pointed a trembling hand toward Sarah, eyes wide in terror and realization, but no words emerged. Only foam, only silence. The youngest, Edmund Jr., writhed against the floorboards, tears streaming, his boyish voice cracking as he begged. First for his mother, then for God. His pleas were swallowed by the rattling in his chest, lungs filling with liquid death. And all the while Sarah stood in the doorway still, watching. Her face unreadable. She did not laugh. She did not cry. She bore witness. Because this was not vengeance in the heat of rage. This was justice performed like ritual, precise, inevitable, and irreversible. Every empire imagines itself invincible, yet here was the proof. An entire dynasty undone not by armies, not by uprisings, but by the quiet patience of one enslaved woman and the forbidden knowledge they had underestimated. That was the terror colonial authorities could never allow recorded. Not that a family died, but that their deaths proved the enslaved were never powerless. The Calvertons had sat down to a feast of triumph. They rose, if they rose at all, as gasp inspectors, their legacy dissolving on the floorboards. And with each choking breath that faded into silence, Sarah did not move. She had already won. When the house finally grew silent, it was not peace. It was the silence of a battlefield after the screams have burned out. Candles guttered in their wax. Smoke rose from the scorched linen where flames had nearly taken hold, and the Grand Calverton dining room reeked of bile, sweat, and decay. The family, once so proud, so untouchable, now lay twisted across the floorboards like discarded dolls. Their jewels clinked faintly as their bodies convulsed in their last spasms. It was a servant boy who found them first. Sent to fetch more wine, he pushed open the heavy doors and froze. His tray fell, shattering across the threshold, the sound echoing through the hall like a pistol shot. Within minutes, the entire household swarmed, maid shrieking, stable hands crossing themselves, the overseer bellowing orders no one obeyed. And in the midst of it all, Sarah stood as she always did, quiet, steady, her apron unstained, her hands folded. They demanded to know what happened. She said nothing. They demanded again, voices cracking with fear, but Sarah's silence was sharper than any confession. Because what could she say? That she had carried across oceans the memory of leaves and roots that kill kings as easily as rats. That she had weaponized the kitchen, the one place they permitted her power. By dawn, word had spread beyond the estate. Magistrates arrived, ministers from the church, men with powdered wigs and polished boots, their faces pale with fear of contagion, not of disease, but of example. They walked among the bodies with handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, muttering words like sickness, contamination, bad meat. Not one of them dared speak the truth they already knew, because if Sarah's act was acknowledged for what it was, then the illusion of control shattered. Every plantation, every grand house across Virginia would tremble at the thought that the enslaved were not merely tools, but keepers of secrets that could unravel dynasties overnight. So the verdict was decided before the trial. The family died of tainted food. Sarah was taken away in chains, accused but never properly tried, her name erased from the official record. They could not allow her story to survive. To tell it truthfully would mean admitting the empire was built on foundations of glass, but truth has its own memory. And though they tried to silence her, Sarah's story slipped between the cracks. Retold in whispers, carried by those who understood what her silence truly meant. They locked Sarah in the cellar of the county jail, stone walls sweating with damp, iron chains biting into her wrists. Days passed without light, without food enough to sustain. Yet when the guards came to drag her before the magistrates, they found her standing tall, eyes steady, as though she had already judged them. The courtroom was a theater. The outcome was written before she entered. Planters, merchants, and ministers filled the benches, not for justice, but for reassurance. They needed to see control restored, order reaffirmed. Witnesses were called, servants trembling, overseers swearing oaths, but none could describe exactly what they had seen, only silence. Only Sarah, still and unbroken. When asked to confess, she did not speak. When asked to plead, she did not move. Her silence spread through the hall like poison of its own, unsettling even the magistrates who thought themselves immune. Because silence is not emptiness, it is refusal. It is resistance. The verdict came swiftly: guilty of poisoning, guilty of murder, guilty of insurrection. Yet in the official record, they avoided her name. Instead, she was a certain Negro wench, an erasure disguised as fact. To record her identity would be to grant her power. And power was the very thing they feared. The execution was staged at dawn. A scaffold erected hastily, soldiers lining the square, the public summoned as warning. They expected fear, weeping hysteria. Instead, Sarah ascended the steps as if she were not condemned but chosen. She looked out over the crowd, slaves, masters, merchants, children. And though she spoke no words, a message spread like wildfire: the empire is not invincible. The noose tightened. The trapdoor fell. The body convulsed once, then stilled. But in that silence afterward, something lingered. A rumor, a memory, a seed of fear planted in the hearts of those who believed themselves untouchable. Within weeks, whispers began that Sarah had not died at all, that she had slipped free and fled into the forests, joining others who plotted in the swamps, that her spirit walked the halls of the Calverton estate, a woman in an apron, watching, waiting. The authorities fought to erase her, but the story persisted, because fear has longer life than fact. And so Sarah became more than a woman. She became a shadow, a warning, a name never written, yet never forgotten. The Calverton estate never recovered. For all their wealth, the house became a mausoleum. Guests stopped visiting. Business partners severed ties, and though the authorities issued statements of tainted food and tragic accident, the truth refused to stay buried. It seeped through the cracks like smoke after fire, unseen but choking. The enslaved whispered first. They whispered in fields at dusk, by the riverbanks at night, retelling Sarah's silence as a language of defiance. Some said her spirit lingered in the kitchen, rattling pots, blowing out candles, curdling milk before it touched the lips of the master. Others swore that on quiet nights, they saw her standing at the end of the long dining table, apron clean, eyes unblinking, waiting for another family feast. White planters spoke too, though only in hushed tones. They called her not by name, but as the cook, the shadow, the poisoner. To them, she was no longer a woman but a specter of rebellion, a nightmare that gnawed at their sleep. They prayed her story would be forgotten, but in trying to bury it, they made it immortal. Generations passed, and the story shifted from memory into folklore. In children's tales, Sarah became the kitchen witch of Virginia, a warning told to keep young ones from sneaking food at night. In plantation sermons, she was invoked as proof of the devil's cunning hidden within the enslaved. Every retelling distorted her, stripping away her truth, wrapping her defiance in fear and superstition. But for those who carried the scars of bondage, Sarah's legend was not horror. It was hope, a whispered reminder that even in chains, resistance was possible, that silence could speak louder than sermons, and patience could topple dynasties. By the mid-1800s, travelers wrote of the Calverton estate as cursed ground. They claimed lights flickered in the windows of the abandoned dining hall, though no servants lived there anymore. Some swore the sound of choking, gasping breath still echoed through the walls each anniversary of the feast. To the fearful, it was a ghost story. To the oppressed, it was prophecy, the empire that silences truth cannot silence it forever. And so Sarah's name was erased from the records. But her shadow became eternal. What happened to Sarah was not unique. Her story, half erased, half mythologized, was the blueprint of empire itself. For centuries, every time resistance flared, it was buried beneath layers of superstition and fear. The powerful knew they could not allow rebellion to be remembered as courage. So they recast it as horror. Across the Caribbean, enslaved women who poisoned their masters became witches. In the Louisiana Bayous, men who led uprisings were remembered as demons, their names stripped but their shadows lingering in folk tales. In Jamaica, Haiti, Brazil, the same pattern repeated. History was rewritten in the language of nightmares, transforming acts of liberation into ghost stories whispered to frightened children. It was a kind of second death, the erasure of identity, by calling Sarah the kitchen witch. Instead of by her name, the magistrates achieved what the noose could not. They made her untouchable, yet unremembered. She became a shadow in the records, a lesson without an author. And this was how empire endured, not only by violence, but by controlling memory itself. But silence is not perfect. Cracks always form. In the fields, the oppressed retold the stories differently. Where the masters heard of demons and curses, the enslaved remembered heroes. Sarah's silence at trial became a symbol, just as Makandal in Haiti, who was said to transform into animals to escape capture, became more than a man. He became a prophecy. The powerful called these legends myths, dismissing them as superstition. Yet in truth, they were acts of preservation. In worlds where names were stripped and records falsified, folklore became the only archive. A dangerous archive, carried in whispers, in songs, in rituals. And so the pattern was set: rebellion would always be recast as haunting. Empire would always rename truth as terror. A woman who poisoned her masters could never be remembered as a strategist, a liberator, a weapon against tyranny. No, she must be called witch, ghost, curse. But what the empire never understood was this: fear lingers longer than obedience. Ghosts last longer than laws. And in their attempt to erase Sarah, they made her eternal, not as they intended, but as the shadow that still stalks every gilded hall built on the backs of the forgotten. The Calverton estate no longer stands. Its walls crumbled long ago, its fields swallowed by weeds, its name erased from polite society's memory. Yet the land remains, and the land remembers. In the 20th century, when developers tried to build over the site, their crews unearthed bones where no cemetery was marked. Ribs, femurs, skulls, buried hastily, without markers, without ceremony. Local officials declared them farm laborers, dismissing questions with bureaucratic ease. But among the bones were objects that did not fit: rusted iron chains, fragments of cookware, glass bottles filled with sediment that smelled faintly of herbs and rot. The work stopped. Construction companies walked away, and the ground was left to rot, like a wound deliberately unhealed. In the decades since, stories have resurfaced. Local teenagers dare each other to walk the field at night. They return pale, swearing they heard the clatter of dishes where no kitchen stands. Some claim they saw a figure, an apron, a silhouette, eyes gleaming from the tree line. Hunters refuse to enter the woods near the old property, saying every animal that strays there falls silent, as if waiting for something unseen. But it is not only superstition. In dusty archives, fragments remain: an unsigned letter from a magistrate warning of the silent cook who unsettled the court, a plantation ledger with the word poison crossed out and replaced with plague. Even in the erasures, her presence bleeds through. And then there are the recordings. In the late 1970s, a paranormal group set up audio equipment on the grounds. They captured a faint sound, almost imperceptible, metal striking metal, as though a ladle against an iron pot. On one tape, clearer than the rest, a woman's voice whispers just one word: wait. Was it interference? A trick of static? Or the echo of a silence so powerful it still refuses to die? The empire tried to bury Sarah beneath names that were not hers, beneath fear, beneath centuries of denial. But here, even now, her story seeps back through soil and stone, haunting the living not with screams, but with the weight of what was never meant to be forgotten. And if you listen closely, if you dare, you may hear it too. You need to understand something. This isn't just a ghost story. It's not a curiosity from a rotting estate, or a fragment of folklore to be whispered at night. It is a mirror. And the question is, what do you see staring back? Because the same forces that erased Sarah are still alive. Empires may have crumbled, plantations may have rotted, but the machinery of silence, of rewriting, of forgetting, still thrives. The powerful still decide what is recorded as fact and what is dismissed as myth. How many truths have been buried under the labels of conspiracy, legend, or superstition? How many silences have been weaponized to protect those in control? Think about it. Sarah's silence was not ignorance. It was strategy. She understood something her captors never could, that words can be twisted. But silence, true silence, is a weapon no court can conquer. That silence haunted them more than any confession ever could. And maybe that's why her shadow lingers. Not because she seeks revenge, but because her story was never finished. Because every time someone calls her a witch, a ghost, a curse, they continue the erasure that began centuries ago. But here's the truth they never wanted you to hear. Sarah was not a phantom. She was real. She was flesh and blood, with hands that cooked, with eyes that watched, with a will stronger than the walls that imprisoned her. She was not the kitchen witch. She was not the shadow. She was a woman who turned silence into power, and that power still unsettles the world. And now, as you listen to this story, you are part of the chain. You can dismiss it, laugh it off, reduce it to folklore like so many before you. Or you can carry it, remember it, refuse to let her name rot beneath empire's lies. Because the truth is this: if you ignore her, if you let them win again, then you will hear her. Not in legends, not in books, but in the stillness of your own home. A clatter in the kitchen, a whisper in the hall, a silence that grows heavier every night until you can no longer tell if it is outside you or inside. They were never meant to hear this. Not her silence, not her defiance, not the truth that survived despite everything. But now you have, and that carries a weight, because hauntings are not about ghosts. They are about memory refusing to die. They are about the cracks in history where the voices of the erased still seep through. You've walked through one of those cracks tonight. You've touched the silence that terrified magistrates, slave masters, and empire itself. And once touched, it does not let you go. Sarah's story is unfinished because it was never allowed to be told. And when stories are silenced, they do not vanish, they echo. They find new ears, new mouths, new generations to unsettle. That is why her name still drifts through shadows. That is why her silence still rattles in kitchens. That is why the land where she lived will never be settled, no matter how many maps are drawn over it. So ask yourself, what will you do with this? Will you treat it as a tale, a curiosity, a bit of darkness to pass the time? Or will you understand it for what it is, a warning? Because the truth is simple. The past is not past. The empire that tried to erase her has only changed its face. The silences they built still surround you. And if you cannot hear them, it is only because you have not been listening closely enough. But when you do, when you finally hear the silence pressing against your own walls, you will know and you will remember her. Because silence is not empty. Silence is not safe. Silence is the sound of history breaking through. And sooner or later it comes for everyone.